Hey you guys, welcome back to my channel. I am so excited about today's video because we get to talk about eyeshadow palettes, which is one of my favorite things to chat about. But not only do we get to talk about eyeshadow palettes, we get to talk about my top 10 favorite eyeshadow palettes of all time. Now I will say I did set a bit of a rule on this. I said the eyeshadow palette had to have been in my collection at least the last year. There were definitely some new releases this year that I wanted to include in this video. I'm thinking of the Natasha Denona Yucca palette, the Glaminatrix Nearly Natural palette, but my hair is in my face. But I really wanted to talk about, or wanted to only consider palettes that really have been in my palette collection for quite some time and have withstood the test of time. They have made it through declutters and are just palettes that I continue to just love throughout my collection. So I had to narrow it down to 10 today. It was very, very difficult, but I have those to share. If you are interested, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I'd love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay, you guys, where to begin? I think maybe we'll start with the palette that I have loved the longest, and that is my Tartelette In Bloom palette. Now, do I think this is the best quality, most groundbreaking palette of all time? Absolutely not. But I just love this palette for what it is. I've mentioned on my channel many times, you probably already know, that I actually did declutter this palette, and then I was missing it so much I went out and repurchased it last year because I just love this palette for those days that I don't want to think about a look to create. I just want something easy. I just want to basically the palette has looks laid out for you. You can follow the rows or the columns and really create such a beautiful look. It's a really easy palette to travel with. There's a nice mirror and it just sits up too. You don't have to even hold it. And it's just very beginner friendly, very just, I call it a workhorse palette or a sweatpants of makeup sort of palette, and that it's just such a comfort palette, such an easy reach. I don't have to think. I'm always gonna get a beautiful look. I feel like all of the shades are easier to work with. It's not the most exciting color story, but for every day, this just works so well. And again, it's something that I literally had to go out and repurchase because I was missing it in my collection. Okay, why don't we just talk about the other palette that I had to repurchase. There's actually two others. I am not talking about the Rowan 1111 today just because while I love that palette, it's definitely a very unique palette in that it's for cream shadows. So I decided not to include that one. But the Natasha Denona Mini Nude, I mean, need I say more? I have also called this a sweatpants sort of palette. What I love about this palette is I can just do something so basic. I can just toss this in the crease, call it a day, and I'm really gonna like it. I can do an all matte look, but then there's the shade, I think it's Sienna, yeah, the shade Sienna, which is this really beautiful kind of green gold sort of shifty shade that I feel adds something truly unique to this palette. This is something that even on special occasions, if I'm going out, I'll even reach into this. It doesn't have to be this big glamorous palette. This is just something I know I'm gonna like the look that I come up with. Yes, there's only 5 shades and you're kind of limited, but I've also just created so many looks that I love with this palette. It's one that I can trust, one I can depend on, one I can rely on. Very easy to just travel with. I will say that my previous palette, my shades had it had gotten very beat up. My cover had broken off, my shades were cracking and crumbling in terms of I had just thrown it everywhere. It'd been traveling with me a lot, but I absolutely love and adore this palette. It's one of my most reached for, so I definitely had to talk about Natasha Denona Mini Nude. We talk about the other Natasha Denona palette that I have to mention, and it is the Natasha Denona Gold palette. I just absolutely love this palette. I feel this was the palette that really made me start to really be interested and love green shadows. I love the shade Lime Chrome up here. I also really love this greeny gold, more chunky, kind of sticky glitter that's really intense and metallic on the eyes. And then I love every single matte brown shade in this palette. I feel is my perfect matte brown shade. I love this row of neutrals, and then you have another kind of neutral matte brown shade, but then you have this really interesting like mustardy, yellowy, greeny brown. I just absolutely adore it. I don't get a ton of use out of the blues, but everything else in this palette I love. I also will say this is like not my favorite lid topper shade. I do really like this gold lid topper, but I'm always happy with the looks that I create with this palette. This is another palette that I feel like I can just rely on and depend on. I've worn this for like holidays, special occasions, going out as well, and I'm always really happy with the looks that I create with this one. So I definitely had to go with Natasha Denona Gold. I know you cannot get this one anymore. I do know that Alter Ego has a dupe to this palette. I have not personally tried the dupe, but I do know Alter Ego has a great eyeshadow formula. I've never been disappointed in another palette that they've created. So if you really like this color story, I would recommend checking out the Goddess palette from Alter Ego. I do also have a code with Alter Ego. I believe it's just Steph. It'll be in the description box down below. I do earn a small commission off that, so if that makes you uncomfortable, you do not have to use it. You do not have to shop with it. But if you're interested in that color story, I highly recommend checking that palette out. Another palette I feel like I've talked about so much on my channel, you also can't get this anymore, but it has a palette out right now that's very similar to it. I think you can still get the Rising Orgasm, which basically has the same color story in my opinion. I just prefer this one because I like the lid topper shades in this is the NARS Summer Solstice palette. This was my first introduction to NARS eyeshadow, and it made me fall in love with NARS. It made me just really fall in love with NARS as a brand. I feel like before this, like I liked my NARS face palettes, but there were quite a few complexion products I had tried from NARS that didn't work for me and my dry skin. I feel like NARS is a very raved about brand, but there's definitely some products from NARS that I was just not a huge fan of. But after falling in love with their eyeshadow formula, it just for some reason really sparked this interest in NARS as a brand for me. I know you only have 2 matte shades in this, and your options are kind of limited in what you're going to create, but I love this in the summer. It was my most reached for palette by far the summer that I picked this up. These 2 lid topper shades are just so stunning and so beautiful on the eyes. I absolutely love them. I also really like the like satin sort of shades as well. I think they're just so beautiful. I absolutely love this. I know I've talked about this palette quite a bit on my channel, so I won't try and like drone on and on and on, but that is definitely an all-time favorite. Another all-time favorite that has not gotten enough love from me, but is definitely like one of the best palettes still in my collection. It is the Persona Identity 1 palette. I absolutely love and adore this palette, and I think what I love the most about this eyeshadow palette, the mattes are very easy to work with and easy to blend. I have no complaints about the mattes, but I love the shimmers because they are so smooth on the eyes that I never get like that heavy eyelid, crepey eyelid sort of look, and they are super intense. I love the shade Bombshell. I've talked about it so many times. It's kind of like this satin taupe with like a hint of a green, and it's just so beautiful. Another shade that kind of made me want to dabble more in greens. I love the shade Seductive. I love the shade Bossy on like the outer third of the eye, just so beautiful. This is definitely a palette that maybe I should consider like doing as part of my pan that palette rotation next year, just trying to hit pan on as many shades as possible. Although I will say the pans are deep and they take a long time, but definitely a favorite, an all-time favorite palette in my collection. I mean, I literally still have the old packaging. That's how old this palette is, and I still love it. Okay, next up, what do I want to talk about? Kaleido Sashimi City. This is just a classic. This is another one that is a go-to if I'm wanting something like kind of intense on the eyes, but just so easy to create. Like I can create the most beautiful look in like 5 minutes with this palette. This is a palette that 5-minute look is something that I would wear out to like go out. It's just so easy. I also will create work appropriate looks with this palette. Work appropriate. This is probably one of my most highly complimented palettes when I wear it, and I think it's because these shimmers are just so sparkly, so beautiful, and everybody, like in my real life, if I wear this palette, they're like, "Ooh, what's on your eyes? That's so pretty." But I also created a look using this palette fairly recently, maybe within the last month, and I filmed a video with it, and I got so many comments asking what was on my eyes. So I'm like, okay, I absolutely love that. There's not one shade in this palette that I feel like is like unnecessary. Sometimes I don't always love like a peachy pink, and I love it in this palette. So I definitely had to talk about this. I think you can still get this Futurism palette off of the Kaleidos website. And if this color story speaks to you, I just could not recommend this palette enough. Okay, another palette you can't get anymore, but it's one of my favorite eyeshadow brands, and I think to date, I think it's my favorite palette. I think it's so tough because there's so many just interesting and unique color stories, but the Odin's Eye Merry Christmas palette, I just think this is such a beautiful palette. I love how many shimmer, metallic, duochrome shades you're getting in here. I love literally every single shimmer. I'm like so obsessed with. I will say there's some mattes sometimes throughout Odin's Eye palettes that just don't work for me. That is not the case with this palette. The only shade that I don't see myself like ever getting a ton of use out of is the shade Poinsettia, just because I don't really reach for a red that often, but this red still performs really nicely. Sometimes I feel like I struggle with reds. That one works really nice. I love that you have like these two shades. I feel like I can create really like a warm base to so many looks, and then I can just pop on any shade in here. It's really the shimmers in here that I'm like, I love every single shimmer. And there's such a variety. You've got greens, you've got like a teal, you've got a hot pink, you have an orange, you have a gold, you have this like pink gold shifty shade that like I always love. You have the shade Snowman, which is like the most beautiful ethereal duochrome shade ever. And it's just, oh, it's such a good one. If they ever brought this palette back, I would say jump on it the moment it's available on the website. Another palette that is not available anymore, but I would also recommend the current palette available in this line. So I have the Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 3. You guys know I have talked about this palette so much on my channel. I actually have a pan on the shade Polaris. I don't know if you'll be able to see. There is that pan. The pans do feel a bit shallow, but I also have used, the Polaris is definitely my most used shade in this palette. So I know you can't get this palette anymore, but I also highly recommend the Danessa Myricks Lightwork Volume 5. If I wasn't going off of my rule that the palette had to be in my collection for at least a year, I may have even shared the Lightwork Volume 5 in this video. What I love about Lightwork Volume 5 is, yes, it's a little bit more expensive than this palette was, but in this palette, you're literally only getting 8 shades. In the Lightwork Volume 5, you are getting 18 total shades. Now, I will say it is an all shimmer palette, so definitely more of a companion palette. But as I always say, with the Danessa Myricks Lightwork palettes, if you are looking to truly add something special to your collection, a special companion palette, that one palette that you always go into when you want to like really add something special to a look, I just think it is so unique. Literally the softest formula, most buttery, creamy, smooth formula I've ever used. So many interesting and unique duochromes, such intense sparkles, and I just truly cannot recommend the Danessa Myricks Lightwork palettes in general enough. Okay, we knew I had to talk about a Huda palette because I love Huda so much, and I think truly like my tippity top all-time favorite. Yes, I love my Huda Mercury Retrograde because it just has this like nostalgic thing going on with it, but I think it would have to go to the Huda Beauty Rose Quartz, especially when I think about think throughout my collection about like my tippity top favorite go-to for like dusty pinks, mauves, dusty purples. This is such a beautiful palette. Again, so many unique textures and tones and finishes, and just truly very beautiful shades. Cosmic Love, Blissful, and Moon Magic are just so beautiful. I also love the shade Energized for a really beautiful kind of satin taupe sort of shade. Self Love, even I really love. I will say typically with the Huda palettes, even like the Empowered palette, which is definitely more like brown leaning, I still feel like my looks always end up looking pink. This is obviously a very pink forward or like purple forward palette, but just something to keep in mind. I absolutely love the Huda larger palettes. They're so beautiful. Again, so many interesting and unique textures and finishes, and Rose Quartz, especially this year, doing No Pan Left Behind for this palette and just creating so many looks with this palette. It is definitely an all-time favorite in my collection. Okay, and then the 10th and final palette. I feel like if you're a longtime subscriber, you're expecting me to say the ABH, not Amrezy, the ABH Jackie palette. And I love this palette, and I probably talked about this palette the most on my channel, like over every other palette. But when I opened this palette up and when I've really started to think about this palette a little bit more this year, while I do really love these 6 shades over here, those 6 shades, and then these 2 shades here, like if this was an 8-pan palette and that's what it looked like hands down, yes. The shade Zam is probably one of my favorite shades, especially for like a metallic gold. In my collection, I have loved the shade Sponsored. I love the mattes, like these 3 mattes. I just absolutely love them. But when I open this palette up and look at it as a whole, my favorite look to create in this, I can create with the palette that I'm about to talk about. And as a whole, I really do love Dose of Colors Friendcation more. Again, I know you can't get this palette anymore either. But this palette offers me more of what I like than this palette does. I still get my green. I get this like really intense brown smoky. I can get that with this, but I also have blues in here. I have this really beautiful shimmery like pinky red sort of shade, but then I can also like mix this red with this blue to create a purple. And sometimes it feels like your options are truly like limitless with this palette. So I think if I really thought about it, but then I thought someone was like, you have to give up one of these 2. Part of me is like, I just don't feel like I give up the shade Zam in this palette. So like, this is my way of really talking about both of these palettes, but I think it's so tough, but I think I should have decided before turning on the film. I'm just like, oh, I do absolutely love Zam. And I do love the mattes in here, but I also love them in here. And I've really created some looks that I absolutely love in this too. So I think, especially because I always reach for this on like country concerts. This is like my go-to special occasion country concert palette, even like more so over this. So all-time favorite, I think we're going with Friendcation for my number 10. But after that, you guys, that is it for today's video. Those are my top 10 favorite palettes of all time. I would love to know in the comments below, what are your favorite palettes of all time? Any of them that were discussed today? Are there some that I don't have in my collection that I need to go check out? Let a girl know in the comments below. Other than that, thank you guys so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting me and my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.